Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to U.S. History Through Film. At this point, we're going to look at the video worksheet for The Last of the Mohicans and talk about some of the questions that illustrate something either historically important about the film or something perhaps just interesting about the film, or also some things that are inaccurate about the movie. One of the first things to emphasize in this way is question number 11. On their way to the fort, the main characters are attacked. And this attack does depict an attack on a small group of British soldiers. This is clearly meant to resemble Braddock's blunder, when British forces in their bright red uniforms were caught off guard in the woods and fought very poorly, having been trained to fight in open fields, firing in ranks and volleys, even an enemy they can't see that's attacking them from every direction. This certainly did happen to some British units. However, in this particular case, it's not accurate. These soldiers are supposed to be members of the 60th Regiment, also known as the Royal Americans, a unit formed of American volunteers who were intended to fight in the woods. In fact, to deal with exactly the kind of attack featured in that scene. So, soldiers from that unit would not really have been as incompetent as shown. Although, of course, it's necessary for the story that they get killed. Number 13 shows the aftermath of an attack by an Ottawa war party on a frontier homestead, and the actual remains of an attack probably would have been even more gruesome, as Indians on the warpath often tortured prisoners to death and mutilated their corpses, in particular often scalping them, both as a war trophy and because agents of the government that supported them would often pay for scalps. If you're not familiar with scalping someone, you simply grab the hair on the top of their head, get a sharp knife, and slip it under the top of the scalp. It'll pop right off. They could be dried in little rings about so big around after stretching them out, and sometimes even painted on the skin side with different colors or symbols. And those symbols would show the hair buyer, as the British or French or other colonial officer who bought them was sometimes known. Those codes would show whether it was a soldier or a farmer or a man or a woman or a child, as they were all paid different rates. Number 14 mentions Reverend Eleazar Wheelock's school, and he was a real person, a Congregationalist minister in Lebanon, Connecticut for 34 years, who did run a school for Indians, where they were taught English language and customs and skills, partly in the hopes of training Indians to become missionaries among their own people. Wheelock later helped to found Dartmouth College with a charter from King George III with the same intent, offering a college education to American Indians in hopes that they in turn might become missionaries among their own people. In fact, it tended to mostly enroll upper-class white students, including Wheelock's son. But while he himself did not create many Indian missionaries, most Mohicans did convert to Christianity, although typically joining the Moravian church and not becoming Congregationalists. Number 16 claims that General Webb did not know that Fort William Henry was besieged, and that's not true. At this point, historically, he was at Fort Edward, which was about 17 miles away, and he could hear the French cannons. But it is true that Webb did not send any reinforcements, but that was because he believed Montcalm's army was much larger than it was. It numbered somewhere between 6,000 and 8,000 men. He believes they had at least 11,000, and he didn't think he could spare enough reinforcements to do any good, so why risk some men on a doomed adventure? Furthermore, his men were the last men standing between the frontier and the city of Albany, and he didn't want to weaken his own defenses. Number 20 shows the good relationship between the French and the Indians and how they did often kind of share their culture. And for the most part, the French did not settle North America heavily. They preferred to trade with the Indians, although there were some farms set up in the St. Lawrence River Valley near Montreal and Quebec and Trois-Rivières and a few others. So they mostly retained a good relationship with the Indians, Indeed, many French hunters and fur trappers adopted the Indian culture, or at least aspects of it. Many of them married Indian wives, but many French priests did convert Indians to Catholicism. Number 22 shows the tension between the British Army and the colonial militia. The militia were believed by the British not to be skilled fighters, which in some cases was true. They often did not have the discipline and the formal training of regular soldiers. But on the other hand, they sometimes fought very well and were often better prepared to fight the irregular style of warfare needed to fight the French and Indians in the forest. And many colonial militiamen, especially their officers, felt they were not appreciated or respected by the British. And George Washington being the most famous example, resenting that his colonial rank of colonel in the Virginia militia was ignored, and he was regarded as no more than a captain. Furthermore, his roles in leading some of the soldiers in Braddock's blunder to safety, commanding troops elsewhere on the frontier, were largely ignored. And the same would be true for many other colonial soldiers and officers. And such treatment would contribute to the resentment against Britain in the years leading up to the American Revolution. And during the American Revolutionary War, British experiences with colonial militia during the French and Indian War would sometimes lead them to underestimate American forces in the Revolutionary War, expecting them to be as incompetent as they had seen some of them be during the French and Indian War. Number 25 is very important. That the English set aside their law, no longer has any authority. And this gets a bit beyond the action of the movie, but it's related to the political idea of contract theory. The idea that the government has a duty to protect the rights of its people, their lives, their liberty, their property. And that if the government does not protect these, especially if the government itself infringes upon these rights, the people have the right, they have the duty to alter or to abolish such a government. A government that does not protect its people's rights does not deserve its people's support. And this would be a very important idea expressed in the Declaration of Independence, here just 19 years after the movie is set. Now, number 28, we see Montcalm's promise that the English soldiers can go back to England. And that was actually pretty common in warfare in the 1700s, even well into the 1800s. Keeping prisoners was expensive and time-consuming, so captured soldiers and officers were often paroled back to their home countries on a condition they not fight in that war, or perhaps that theater of the war again. Again, these soldiers were allowed to go back to England on a condition they never again fight in America. Now, if a paroled soldier was later caught fighting where he wasn't supposed to be, he could be executed for breaking his parole. And this would remain common into the 1800s. Although there certainly were cases of captured soldiers being put in prison camps, and those were often pretty horrific, particularly the prison ships used by the British during the American Revolution. Number 34, of course, is about the massacre on the way back from Fort William Henry. And it is true that Monroe's men were attacked, and many were killed or wounded. But the attack came at the rear of their line, and many soldiers, including Monroe himself, survived the massacre and escaped to Fort Edward. And Monroe was not killed in the attack. He did a lot to play it up as a massacre, which certainly it was a big breach of the promise they could have safe passage back home, but it didn't wipe them all out. Monroe, though, did die 3 months later, walking down the streets of Albany. He just dropped dead. They said of apoplexy, which in those days might have meant a heart attack or an aneurysm or a stroke. He just fell over dead about 3 months later. Furthermore, Montcalm did not encourage or turn a blind eye to the attack as suggested in the film. Indeed, he tried to discourage it beforehand, even tried to stop it when it was taking place. In number 39, we see Duncan translating Nathaniel's words into French, something I mentioned before watching the movie. Again, most educated Europeans learn multiple languages, and so for an educated officer like Duncan to be able to speak French was not at all unusual. And on the frontier, many people learned multiple languages, at least enough to get by, especially people like Nathaniel and Uncas and Chingachgook, who were trading with the English, the French, and various Indian nations. Number 40 refers to the fact that the fur trade was very lucrative, so much so that many Indian tribes became dependent on European trade goods and using metal pots and pans rather than cooking things on stones or in clay vessels. And indeed, furs became so valuable that American Indians drove animals with valuable furs to extinction or very close. And Indians and Europeans often fought each other over access to the best hunting grounds. Indeed, one could argue that that was one cause of the French and Indian War itself. And there were many smaller scale conflicts around the Great Lakes in New York and Canada, sometimes known as the Beaver Wars, because access to beavers for their pelts was an important cause of those wars. Now, number 48 often confuses people a bit in the movie. Alice jumping off the cliff seems to be a little bit excessive. Of course, she did not want to become Magwa's wife and have his children, but while it's not real clear in the movie, she is supposed to have fallen deeply in love with Uncas, who of course had just been killed. And it also explains why he was so reckless in his attempt to rescue her. But again, it's not really obvious in the movie. Even if you know to look for it, it doesn't really stand out. It played a much bigger role in the original script, but the movie studio cut a lot of the script because they felt it was too long. And the mother of the actress playing Alice insisted on being on the set with her because she was just 16 and wouldn't let her take part in any physical love scene or anything that might be too much for a 16-year-old girl. So her mother was extremely protective and ended up having almost the entire love story cut out of the movie, at least for Alice and Uncas. Of course, number 50, we discover that the last of the Mohicans is Chingachgook. But in fact, that is not entirely true. While the Mohican people were driven out of New York and Massachusetts, eventually ending up in Wisconsin, they were not completely destroyed. There are at least 3,000 alive today and do have a reservation in Wisconsin. They have sued New York to regain land they lost there, and even got a small amount of land and the right to build a casino in 2010. All this was controversial, as some people in New York didn't want to give up any land, and some Mohicans were not happy because when they accepted this land, they, in exchange, gave up much larger land claims. And the court cases continue in New York. And while there's no specific question for it on the worksheet, the final scene of Chingachgook describing how his people are vanishing and the frontier belongs to people like Nathaniel and Cora. And they, in turn, will move west, but eventually even people like them will vanish. Is really a very powerful illustration of an historical theory known as the frontier thesis, proposed in 1893 by Frederick Jackson Turner. Something that we may discuss later on in this or other classes.